Black man helped a desperate woman change her tire. The next day, a black SUV showed up at his house. Derrick Johnson lived a life of quiet purpose. In the small town of Maplewood, where life moved at a slower pace and everyone knew each other by name, Derrick had carved out a reputation as someone reliable, kind, and always willing to lend a hand. At 36, he had settled into a comfortable routine, one that gave him a sense of peace and fulfillment that not many could boast about. Maplewood wasn't a flashy town, nor did it try to be. It was a place where generations of families had lived and worked, where most of the houses had been standing for more than half a century, their histories tied up with the people who occupied them. Derrick's own home was a modest but well-kept two-bedroom house on the edge of town, the kind with a front porch that invited neighbors to stop by for a chat, and a backyard where the garden bloomed from the care he put into it each weekend. His house was simple, just like his life, but Derrick liked it that way. Every morning, Derrick would wake up just as the sun began to rise, the first light of day casting a soft glow over Maplewood's quiet streets. He would start his day with a strong cup of coffee, brewed just the way he liked it, and take a few moments on his porch, savoring the peace that only came before the rest of the world stirred to life. He wasn't a man of many words, but in those early morning hours, he didn't need any. The stillness, the chirping of the birds, and the distant sound of a car starting down the street were enough to ground him. It reminded him that he belonged here, in this small town that had always been home. Derrick worked as a maintenance technician for the town's public works department, a job that suited him perfectly. He had always been good with his hands, able to fix just about anything, whether it was repairing a broken water pipe, patching up a leaky roof, or doing electrical work. Derrick was the man people called. His skills weren't glamorous, but they were indispensable. Over the years, he had become the quiet backbone of the town, ensuring that things ran smoothly, even if most people didn't realize just how much he contributed. Derrick didn't mind, though. He wasn't in it for recognition. He simply liked knowing that he could help. His co-workers liked him, and so did the townspeople. Derrick wasn't one for drama or attention. He just showed up, did his job, and went home. But when someone needed help, whether it was a neighbor who needed their fence fixed or an elderly couple whose sink wouldn't stop leaking, Derrick would show up with his toolbox and a smile. It was never about money for him. It was about doing what was right. His father had raised him that way, teaching him that a man's worth wasn't in what he had, but in what he gave to others. Maplewood was full of people who appreciated Derrick's quiet generosity. There was Mrs. Jenkins, the widow who lived 3 houses down from him. Derrick had repaired her roof last winter after a storm had ripped off several shingles, refusing to take any payment. Then there was the Sims family, whose old pickup truck Derrick had helped get running again, just in time for their road trip out of town. They had tried to offer him something, but Derrick had just waved them off, saying he was happy to help. It was gestures like these that had earned Derrick the respect of the town, even though he never sought it. In a town like Maplewood, everyone looked out for one another, and Derrick was a big part of that. He enjoyed the sense of community, the unspoken understanding that if you needed something, you only had to ask. That's what made Maplewood different from the bigger cities where people hurried past one another without so much as a glance. Here, life moved slower, and Derrick liked that. He liked knowing the people at the local diner by name, liked how the owner of the hardware store always asked about his latest project, and how the kids playing in the park would wave when they saw him drive by in his old truck. His job at the Public Works Department wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. He would spend his days repairing streetlights, fixing potholes, and maintaining the town's buildings. The work could be tough at times, but it gave Derrick a sense of satisfaction. It felt good to keep things running, to know that in some small way, he was helping to keep the town together. And when he wasn't working, Derrick found peace in the simple pleasures of life. On weekends, he would often be found in his garden, tending to the flowers and vegetables he grew in neat rows behind his house. It wasn't a big garden, but it was enough to keep him busy, and the satisfaction of growing something with his own hands was unmatched. Derrick didn't need much to be happy. He wasn't one for flashy cars or expensive gadgets. His truck, an old Ford that had seen better days, suited him just fine. He didn't see the need to upgrade, even though his friends sometimes teased him about it. That thing's going to fall apart on you one of these days, where they would say. But Derrick would just laugh it off. As long as it got him where he needed to go, that was good enough for him. He was a man who valued simplicity and hard work, and that was exactly how he lived his life. Derrick's evenings were spent in much the same way as his mornings, quiet and peaceful. He would often sit on his porch as the sun set, watching the day fade into night. Sometimes he'd have a book in his hands, other times he'd just watch the world go by. The occasional car would pass, a neighbor would wave, and life would continue, steady and unhurried. Derrick found comfort in the predictability of it all. But beneath the surface of his contentment was a deeper sense of purpose. Derrick wasn't just coasting through life. He genuinely cared about making things better, even if only in small ways. His father had been the same way, always looking out for others, always willing to help without asking for anything in return. It was a lesson that had stuck with Derrick throughout his life. Helping others wasn't about getting something back. It was about doing what was right because it was the right thing to do. There was something profoundly fulfilling about knowing that, in his own way, he was making a difference. Derrick didn't need recognition or applause. The gratitude in someone's eyes when he fixed a problem was enough. That was all he needed to feel satisfied at the end of the day. Maplewood had a way of making people feel connected, and for Derrick, that connection was the heart of everything. The people, the town, the simple life. This was his world, and he wouldn't have had it any other way. What Derrick didn't know was that his simple, fulfilling life was about to be turned upside down. He had always believed that doing good would bring good in return, but sometimes the consequences of kindness are unpredictable, and life has a way of shifting in ways you can't foresee. It was only a matter of time before fate would test the strength of Derrick's beliefs, challenging him in ways he never could have anticipated. It was a bright afternoon when Derrick found himself driving home from a job at the edge of Maplewood. He had spent most of the day fixing a broken water main at a nearby farm and was looking forward to an evening of quiet. The familiar road back into town was dotted with towering oak trees and rolling fields, the sort of scenery that had become a comforting constant in Derrick's life. His old truck hummed along the winding road, the window cracked open to let in the fresh air. As he drove, Derrick's mind wandered, thinking about the tasks he had lined up for the next day. Mrs. Anderson had asked him to take a look at her leaky faucet, and there was a tree down near the park that needed clearing. Simple jobs, nothing out of the ordinary, just the way he liked it. But as he rounded a bend, something caught his eye. Parked awkwardly on the shoulder of the road was a small silver sedan. Its hazard lights blinked feebly in the midday sun, and beside it stood a woman, pacing nervously. Derrick slowed his truck, glancing over at the woman as he passed. She seemed flustered, her phone in hand, and as Derrick got closer, he could see the unmistakable slump of a flat tire on the rear wheel of her car. Instinctively, Derrick pulled over a little ways ahead of the car and put his truck in park. It wasn't in his nature to drive past someone in need. The road was a quiet one, and not many people would be passing through. He grabbed a pair of work gloves from the passenger seat and stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching beneath his boots as he made his way toward the stranded car. The woman looked up as Derrick approached, her expression a mix of relief and hesitation. Up close, she appeared to be in her early 30s, with long brown hair tied back into a ponytail. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, the kind of outfit that suggested she hadn't been expecting to deal with car trouble today. Her face, though pretty, was drawn with worry, and she clutched her phone tightly in her hand, as if willing it to solve her problem. "Need a hand?" Derrick asked, his voice calm and reassuring. He wasn't one to make small talk, but he knew the right words to say when someone was in distress. The woman hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I don't know what happened. I was just driving, and then all of a sudden the tire blew out." Her voice wavered slightly, betraying the nerves she was trying to keep in check. Derrick nodded, glancing at the tire. "Looks like a clean blowout. I've got a jack and a spare in my truck if you don't have one." He glanced at her car, noting that it didn't seem particularly well equipped for roadside emergencies. The woman fumbled with her keys, unlocking the trunk. "I think there's a spare in here somewhere, but I don't know how to change it." "That's all right," Derrick said, already moving to grab his tools from his truck. "I can take care of it for you. Won't take long." As Derrick retrieved the jack and lug wrench, The woman shifted uneasily, glancing down the road. She seemed distracted, her eyes darting around as if she was expecting something, or someone. Derrick noticed her behavior, but didn't comment. It wasn't unusual for people to be a little on edge in a situation like this. Being stranded on the side of the road could make anyone anxious. He set to work quickly, loosening the lug nuts on the flat tire and positioning the jack under the car. "Name's Derrick, by the way," he said over his shoulder as he started lifting the car off the ground. "Lily," the woman replied, though her voice sounded distant. She was still holding her phone, scrolling through it absent-mindedly, but there was a tightness in her movements, like she couldn't quite relax. Derrick worked efficiently, keeping his focus on the task at hand. He had changed countless tires over the years, and this was no different. As he pulled the flat tire off and rolled it to the side, he glanced up at Lily again. She was biting her lip, her brow furrowed in thought. Something about her didn't quite fit the usual pattern. Derrick had helped plenty of people in similar situations, roadside breakdowns, car trouble. But Lily seemed more than just inconvenienced. She seemed nervous, and not just the kind of nervous that came with being stranded. "You all right?" Derrick asked, pausing for a moment to look up at her. Lily blinked, as if pulled from her thoughts. She forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little shaken up, I guess. You know, with the tire and all." Derrick nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Still, it wasn't his place to pry. People had their own problems, and sometimes those problems were more than just a flat tire. He turned his attention back to the car, tightening the lug nuts on the spare tire. "Should be good to go in a minute," he said, giving the wrench a final twist. He lowered the car back to the ground and wiped his hands on a rag. "Just make sure to get the tire checked out at a shop when you get into town." Lily nodded, her eyes flicking toward the road again. "Thank you. I really appreciate it." Derrick straightened up, feeling a faint sense of unease himself now. Something wasn't right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way she kept looking over her shoulder, or the way her voice seemed forced, as though she was trying to appear calm but wasn't. But again, it wasn't his place to dig into someone else's troubles. "Do you need a ride into town?" he asked, sensing that maybe she didn't want to be out here any longer than necessary. "Maplewood's not far. I can follow you. Make sure everything's all right with the car." For a moment, Lily seemed to consider his offer, but then she shook her head quickly. "No, that's okay. I'll be fine. I just need to make a few calls." Derrick didn't push it. He had done what he could, and if she said she was fine, then there wasn't much more he could do. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole situation. He glanced at her again, noting the way she was gripping her phone like it was a lifeline. "All right," he said slowly, wiping his hands one last time. "If you're sure." Lily nodded again, this time more firmly. "Yeah, thanks again. You really saved me." Derrick gave her a small nod and started walking back to his truck. He felt her eyes on him the whole time, watching him until he opened the door and climbed inside. As he turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered to life, and he glanced back in his rearview mirror. Lily was still standing there, looking down the road as if she was waiting for something, or someone. Shaking off the strange feeling that clung to him, Derrick pulled back onto the road and continued on his way home. He couldn't quite explain why, but something about that encounter stuck with him long after he had driven away. He had helped plenty of people before, but there was something different about Lily, something that nagged at the back of his mind as the miles stretched out behind him. By the time Derrick pulled into his driveway, the unease had faded somewhat, replaced by the comforting familiarity of home. The sun was beginning to dip low on the horizon, casting a warm golden light over Maplewood streets. Derrick parked his truck and climbed out, looking around at the quiet neighborhood. He could hear kids playing a few houses down, their laughter carried on the evening breeze. He tried to shake off the lingering sense of oddness from the encounter with Lily. It was probably nothing. People got nervous when their cars broke down all the time. Maybe she was just in a hurry, late for something. Or maybe she had been dealing with something else entirely that had nothing to do with the flat tire. Derrick had no way of knowing, and it wasn't his place to ask. Still, as he settled into his routine that evening, grabbing a quick dinner, flipping through the channels on the TV, he found his mind drifting back to the look on Lily's face, the way she had kept glancing at the road, the tight grip she had on her phone. It was as if she had been expecting something bad to happen. But what? Derrick shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts. There was no point in dwelling on it. He had done what he could. Whatever was going on with Lily wasn't his problem to solve. And yet, as he lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that somehow his brief encounter with her wasn't over. Something told him that this small act of kindness, this simple gesture of changing a tire, had set something into motion. Something that, even if he didn't know it yet, would change everything. The next morning, Derrick awoke to the familiar sounds of birds chirping outside his window and the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the curtains. It was a peaceful start to the day, just like any other, and for a few brief moments, he lay in bed, soaking in the tranquility. The lingering unease from his encounter with Lily the day before had faded overnight, leaving behind only the faintest trace of curiosity. Derrick had helped someone in need, and as far as he was concerned, that was the end of it. He rolled out of bed, stretched, and went through his usual morning routine. A hot shower, a cup of strong coffee, and a glance out the window at his quiet neighborhood. Everything was just as it always was. Maplewood streets were still, save for a few early risers walking their dogs or getting a head start on the day's errands. Derrick enjoyed this time of the morning, when the world seemed to be waking up slowly, with none of the rush or urgency that came later in the day. As he sat at his kitchen table, finishing his coffee, Derrick's thoughts returned briefly to Lily. He wondered if she had made it into town all right, if she had gotten the tire checked out like he had suggested. Maybe he'd see her at the local repair shop if she decided to get it fixed there, though he doubted it. People who passed through Maplewood didn't usually stick around for long. Most of the time, they were just passing through on their way to somewhere else. With a shrug, Derrick set his empty mug in the sink and grabbed his keys. There was work to be done, and he wasn't one to sit around when there were things to take care of. As he climbed into his truck, the familiar creak of the door and the hum of the engine brought him back to the present. It was just another day, like any other. But as Derrick backed out of his driveway, he noticed something unusual. Parked a little ways down the street, just far enough to be out of immediate sight but close enough to raise suspicion, was a black SUV. Derrick wasn't the kind of person to pay much attention to cars, but this one stood out. Maplewood wasn't the kind of town where unfamiliar vehicles lingered for long, especially not early in the morning. The SUV had tinted windows, making it impossible to see inside, and it was positioned as if it had been there for a while, not just passing through. Derrick frowned slightly but told himself it was nothing. Maybe someone visiting a neighbor, maybe a friend of one of the families nearby. He had no reason to be suspicious, and yet, the sight of the black SUV stirred something in him, a faint echo of the unease he had felt the day before. Shaking it off, Derrick pulled onto the road and headed toward the town center, putting the strange vehicle out of his mind. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. Derrick spent the first few hours at Mrs. Anderson's house, fixing her leaky faucet and chatting with her about the latest goings-on in town. She was always eager to share the latest gossip, but Derrick only half listened as he worked. His mind was elsewhere, drifting back to that SUV, and though he tried to focus on the task at hand, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off. After finishing up at Mrs. Anderson's, Derrick made his way across town to the park, where the downed tree from the recent storm needed clearing. It was a big job, and as he worked, cutting the branches and hauling them away, the physical labor helped to distract him from the nagging sense of unease. The day was warm, the sky clear, and for a while Derrick lost himself in the familiar rhythm of his work. It wasn't until he was packing up his tools later that afternoon that he noticed the SUV again. It was parked across the street from the park now, in the shade of a large oak tree, as if it had been following him. Derrick's hand froze on the handle of his toolbox, his brow furrowing in concern. The same black SUV, the same dark, tinted windows. This time, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't just a coincidence. Someone was watching him. Derrick glanced around the park, but there were only a few people around, mothers with strollers, kids playing on the swings. None of them seemed to be paying any attention to the SUV, as if it was invisible to everyone but him. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the vehicle, trying to make sense of it. Who would be following him? And why? He hadn't done anything out of the ordinary, hadn't gotten involved in anything that would draw this kind of attention, except for Lily. The thought hit him like a freight train. Could it be connected to her? He hadn't thought much about it at the time, but now, the strange way she had acted, the nervous glances, the way she had kept looking over her shoulder, it all came flooding back. Something about her had been off, and now this SUV was following him around town. It couldn't be a coincidence. Derrick's pulse quickened as he considered the possibilities. Was she in trouble? Was someone looking for her? And if so, had his act of kindness somehow dragged him into the middle of it? He had no answers. But the longer he stood there, the more the unease crept into his chest, wrapping itself around his thoughts like a tightening vice. He didn't like it. He didn't like feeling watched, and he definitely didn't like the idea that he might have unknowingly stepped into something dangerous. Derrick was a simple man, and he liked to keep his life that way. This, whatever it was, wasn't something he had asked for, but now it seemed he had no choice but to confront it. With a final glance at the SUV, Derrick climbed into his truck, his movements slower and more deliberate than usual. His mind raced as he pulled out of the park and headed toward home. The SUV didn't follow him right away, but Derrick kept an eye on his rearview mirror, half expecting it to appear at any moment. He drove through the quiet streets of Maplewood, his usual route now feeling different, more tense, as if something dark had settled over the town without anyone noticing. When he finally pulled into his driveway, he took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The SUV was nowhere to be seen, at least for now, but Derrick had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. He sat in his truck for a few minutes, staring at the dashboard, trying to figure out what to do next. Should he call someone? The police? But what would he even say? That a mysterious SUV had been following him? They'd think he was paranoid. And maybe he was. Maybe this was all just a misunderstanding, a case of him jumping to conclusions. But deep down, Derrick knew better. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Something was going on, and he needed to get to the bottom of it before it got worse. As he stepped out of his truck, Derrick's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he considered letting it go to voicemail. But something compelled him to answer. "Hello?" he said cautiously. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a familiar voice. "Derrick, it's Lily." Derrick's stomach dropped. He hadn't expected to hear from her again, especially not like this. He gripped the phone tighter, his voice steady but guarded. "Lily, what's going on?" There was another pause, and when Lily spoke again, her voice was strained, like she was trying to hold back panic. "I'm sorry, Derrick. I didn't want to drag you into this. I really didn't." Derrick's pulse quickened. "Into what, Lily? What's going on?" "I can't explain everything right now," she said, her words rushed. "But I need you to listen to me. That SUV you've seen, it's not just a coincidence. They're looking for me, and now they're watching you because you helped me." Derrick felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a wave of unease crashing over him. "Who are they, Lily? What do they want?" Lily hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's complicated, my family. They're involved in some things, dangerous things, and now because of what you did, you're on their radar." Derrick's mind raced as he tried to piece together what little information she was giving him. "What do you mean, dangerous things? What am I supposed to do?" "You need to stay away from them," she said, her voice urgent. "Whatever they offer you, no matter what they say, don't trust them. They'll try to manipulate you, try to pull you into their world. And once you're in, there's no getting out." Derrick's grip on the phone tightened. This was worse than he had imagined. He had thought he was just helping a woman with a flat tire, but now he was caught up in something far more dangerous than he had realized. His mind swirled with questions, but before he could ask any more, Lily's voice cut through the fog. "I'm sorry, Derrick. I wish I could explain more, but I can't right now. Just be careful. And if you see them again, don't engage. I'll find a way to fix this. But until then, stay safe." The line went dead, leaving Derrick standing in his driveway, the phone still pressed to his ear. The weight of what Lily had told him settled heavily on his shoulders, and for the first time in a long while, Derrick felt truly out of his depth. This wasn't a simple problem he could fix with a wrench or a few tools. This was something bigger, something darker, and it had come crashing into his quiet, simple life without warning. As Derrick stood there, staring out at the empty street, he couldn't help but feel the invisible eyes of the black SUV watching him, even if it wasn't there. And for the first time in his life, Derrick wasn't sure what to do next. Derrick stood frozen in his driveway for what felt like hours, though it was only a few minutes. The weight of the phone call with Lily hung heavily on his shoulders, the urgency of her words still echoing in his mind. He replayed everything she had said over and over, trying to make sense of it. She hadn't given him much to go on, just vague warnings and cryptic references to her family's involvement in something dangerous. Whatever it was, it had now extended its shadow over Derrick's life, and the reality of that hit him like a punch to the gut. He looked up and down his quiet street, half expecting to see the black SUV lurking around the corner. But the street was empty, as peaceful as ever. Kids were riding their bikes a few houses down, and Mrs. Jenkins was watering her flowers across the road. It was all so normal, so typical of Maplewood, yet Derrick knew his life had shifted. Things weren't what they seemed anymore. He had unknowingly stepped into a world of danger, and even though he couldn't see it, he could feel it creeping closer. He walked inside his house, locking the door behind him out of habit, though for the first time, he wondered if that was enough. It wasn't like him to be paranoid, but the knowledge that someone had been following him, watching him, made his skin crawl. He sat down at his kitchen table, his thoughts swirling. What was he supposed to do now? He had no idea who these people were, no idea how deep their involvement went, and no clear sense of how to protect himself. All he had was Lily's warning to stay away, to not trust anything they offered. But who exactly were they? What did they want with Lily, and why had helping her made Derrick a target? He had so many questions and not nearly enough answers. All he knew was that he had gotten involved in something far bigger than a flat tire on the side of the road. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous energy. Derrick tried to go about his usual routine, but everything felt off. He couldn't focus on the tasks he normally took comfort in. Even the quiet solace of his garden, where he usually found peace, didn't help calm his nerves. Every creak of the house, every passing car, sent his heart racing, making him jumpy in a way he had never felt before. He was on edge, constantly looking over his shoulder, expecting something, or someone, dangerous to emerge at any moment. As the afternoon wore on, Derrick considered calling the police. But what would he tell them? That an SUV had been following him, and that a woman he barely knew had warned him about something vague and dangerous? They'd probably dismiss it as nothing more than a misunderstanding, a bit of paranoia. And what if they did believe him? Would involving the authorities make things worse? Would that escalate the situation, bringing even more attention to him and his quiet life in Maplewood? The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across his backyard, and Derrick still had no answers. He hated feeling powerless, hated that there was nothing tangible he could do to fix this problem. He was a man of action, someone who liked to take control of situations, to solve things with his hands. But this was beyond his control. As evening fell, Derrick's phone rang again. His heart leapt into his throat, and he snatched it up quickly, half expecting it to be Lily again. But when he saw the number on the screen, it wasn't her. It was an unknown number, but something about it felt familiar. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" he said, his voice tense. There was a brief pause on the other end, and then a deep, smooth voice spoke. "Mr. Johnson, I presume?" Derrick's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" "My name is Bennett," the voice replied, calm and measured. "I believe you've already been made aware of the situation involving Miss Lily Hamilton." Derrick's pulse quickened. Bennett. The name sent a shiver down his spine, and he didn't need Lily's warning to know that this man was part of the trouble. The way Bennett spoke was unnerving, too calm, too collected, like he already knew the outcome of the conversation before it even began. "Yeah, I'm aware," Derrick said, his tone edged with wariness. "What do you want?" "We want to thank you for the assistance you provided to Miss Hamilton," Bennett replied smoothly. It was an act of kindness that has not gone unnoticed by her family. The Hamiltons are very grateful for what you've done, and they would like to extend an offer to you. Derek's heart sank. This was it. This was what Lily had warned him about. "I'm not interested in any offers," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Bennett chuckled lightly, as if Derek's response was exactly what he had expected. "I understand your hesitation, Mr. Johnson, but I assure you, this offer is quite generous. You see, the Hamilton family is a very powerful one, with resources that could change your life. All we're asking is that you consider the possibilities. After all, a man like you, someone who has worked hard his entire life, surely deserves a reward for such an altruistic act." Derek's jaw tightened. The way Bennett was speaking made it sound so simple, so harmless. But Derek wasn't fooled. There was more to this than a reward for helping Lily, and whatever the Hamilton family was involved in, he didn't want any part of it. "I'm not interested in your money," Derek said firmly. Bennett's tone shifted slightly, becoming more pointed. "This isn't just about money, Mr. Johnson. It's about opportunity. You've been noticed by people who can offer you things that most men only dream of: a better life, security, influence. All you have to do is accept." Derek felt a knot of tension coil in his stomach. He didn't like the way Bennett was talking, the subtle pressure behind his words. It was clear that this wasn't just an offer. This was a test, a trap even, and Derek wasn't about to walk into it blindly. "What's the catch?" Derek asked, his voice cold. There was a pause on the other end, a brief silence that stretched uncomfortably. When Bennett spoke again, his voice was as smooth as ever, but there was an undercurrent of something darker, something menacing. "No catch, Mr. Johnson. We simply believe that a man of your character would appreciate what we're offering. But of course, the choice is yours." Derek's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't trust this man, didn't trust any of it. But what could he do? He didn't know how deep this went or what kind of power the Hamilton family really wielded. All he knew was that getting involved with them would come at a price, and it wasn't one he was willing to pay. "I'll pass," Derek said sharply. "Tell the Hamiltons I'm not interested." Bennett was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, there was a trace of amusement in his voice. "Very well, Mr. Johnson, but I suggest you reconsider. The Hamiltons are not people you want to say no to. You may not understand it now, but trust me, this is an opportunity you'll regret turning down." Before Derek could respond, the line went dead. He stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand, his mind racing. The calm threat in Bennett's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't over. They weren't going to let him walk away so easily. Whatever the Hamilton family was involved in, it was powerful enough that they expected people to fall in line without question. And Derek, by refusing, had just painted a target on his back. His hands were shaking as he set the phone down on the table. He couldn't stay here. Not like this. Not when they were watching him, waiting for him to make a move. He didn't know what to expect next, but the feeling of danger had grown too intense to ignore. He had to figure out what his next steps were, how to protect himself, how to keep his life from spiraling out of control. That night, sleep eluded Derek. Every time he closed his eyes, the events of the day played out in his mind. The black SUV, Lily's frantic call, Bennett's smooth, unsettling voice. He tossed and turned, his mind unable to find peace. The weight of the situation pressing down on him with increasing intensity. What had he gotten himself into? All because of a simple act of kindness, a flat tire and a roadside stop. It seemed absurd, and yet here he was, caught in the web of something far larger than he could have ever imagined. When dawn finally broke, Derek felt no relief. The uncertainty gnawed at him, pulling him deeper into a sense of dread. He needed help, needed to talk to someone who could give him perspective. But who could he trust with this? He couldn't just confide in his friends or neighbors. This wasn't some local issue that could be resolved with a favor or a few well-placed phone calls. He thought about Lily. She was the only one who knew the full extent of what was happening. She had warned him after all, but now she had vanished again, leaving him to deal with the fallout. Was she still out there hiding? Was she safe? Did she even have the ability to stop what was coming, as she had promised? Derrick didn't know, and he hated not knowing. He hated the powerlessness of it all. As the morning stretched on, Derrick found himself pacing the floor of his house, his mind racing with possibilities. What should he do next? He didn't want to go into hiding. He wasn't the type to run from a problem. But standing still felt just as dangerous. Every instinct in his body told him that the Hamiltons weren't done with him yet, that Bennett's call was only the beginning. They would come back, and the next time, the stakes would be even higher. Derrick stopped by the window, staring out at his quiet street, the sun rising over the rooftops. He couldn't see the SUV, but he knew it was out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. The decision loomed large before him: take the reward and be drawn into their world, or resist and face whatever consequences came next. Neither choice felt safe, but Derrick knew one thing for certain: he wasn't about to give up his life, his values, for anyone, not even the Hamilton family. The tension in Derrick's life had grown into an unbearable weight over the next few days. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, constantly checking over his shoulder, peering out windows and scanning the streets for any sign of the black SUV. The once peaceful town of Maplewood now felt like a stage set for something ominous. It was no longer the safe, familiar place Derrick had always known. Instead, it had taken on an unfamiliar tone of danger. The invisible presence of the Hamiltons lingered like a storm cloud, waiting to break open. Derrick tried to go about his day as usual, but everything felt different now. Every interaction with his neighbors and co-workers seemed layered with an underlying unease. At work, while fixing a broken streetlight or repairing a leaky pipe, he found it impossible to focus fully. His mind was constantly replaying the conversation with Bennett, the man's calm, measured voice echoing in his thoughts, reminding him of the consequences of his refusal. One morning, after another restless night, Derrick decided to confide in his closest friend, Greg, a man he had known for over 20 years. Greg was a straightforward, no-nonsense guy who had grown up in Maplewood just like Derrick. He was the type of person you could trust to tell things straight and not overcomplicate a situation. Derrick needed someone to help him think this through, someone grounded and rational. They met at a small diner on the outskirts of town, a place they had frequented for years whenever they needed to talk. The diner had an old-fashioned charm to it. Red vinyl booths, checkered floors, and a bell above the door that jingled whenever someone walked in. It was quiet this morning, the early hour keeping most of the regulars at home. Derrick and Greg slid into a booth near the back, the waitress bringing over 2 mugs of coffee without needing to ask for their order. Greg leaned back in the booth, his arms crossed over his chest, watching Derrick carefully. "You've been off, man. I can see it all over you. What's going on?" Derrick stared into his coffee for a moment, trying to find the right words. The idea of telling Greg everything felt daunting, like it would make the danger even more real, but he needed to unload the burden. "I've gotten myself into something, Greg. Something bigger than I realized." Greg raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt, letting Derrick continue. "It all started with this woman I helped a few days ago. She had a flat tire on the side of the road. I didn't think much of it at the time, just doing what I always do, you know? But after I helped her, things started getting strange. I noticed a black SUV following me around town. Then she calls me and tells me her family's involved in some dangerous stuff. And now," Derrick paused, trying to control the edge of fear creeping into his voice. "Now her family's trying to offer me something, some reward. They keep making it sound like an opportunity, but I can feel there's more to it." Greg took a sip of his coffee, his face thoughtful but concerned. "This woman, who is she? What kind of family are we talking about here?" "She's Lily Hamilton, from the Hamilton family. You've heard of them, right? They're billionaires, real high society types. But according to her, they're mixed up in some pretty dangerous things. Stuff I don't even want to know the details of." Greg let out a low whistle. "The Hamiltons? Man, you're right. That's serious. I've heard whispers about them. People say they've got their hands in all kinds of shady dealings, not just business, but darker stuff. Nobody really knows the full story, but it's always been clear that they're not the kind of people you want to mess with." Derrick nodded, grateful that Greg understood the gravity of the situation. "Exactly. And now I'm caught in the middle of it because I helped Lily. One of their guys, Bennett, called me, offering me a reward. He was polite enough, but there was an underlying threat in his voice. Like I don't have a choice, but I'm not about to sell my soul for whatever they're offering. Greg frowned, leaning forward, his expression more serious. So, what are you going to do? If they're already watching you, it's not like you can just walk away. They'll keep pushing until they get what they want. I know, Derrick admitted, his frustration clear. That's the problem. I don't want anything to do with them, but I don't know how to make this stop. I've been thinking about leaving town, maybe just disappearing for a while until things cool down. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that running won't solve anything. These people are too powerful. They'd find me. Greg rubbed his chin, thinking, yeah, running's not the answer. You'd only be putting yourself in more danger. They've probably got connections everywhere. And you know this town. You leave, and people are going to notice. Word'll get back to them, and they'll see it as you trying to escape. That could make things worse. Derrick sighed heavily, feeling trapped. So what then? I don't want to take their offer, but I can't just wait around for them to come after me. Greg was silent for a long moment, his eyes narrowing in thought. Then he spoke slowly, as if piecing the idea together as he said it. You know, there might be a way out of this. You've always been about helping people, right? That's why you helped this Lily in the first place. What if you flip the script on them? Instead of rejecting their offer outright, you use it to your advantage. Derrick looked at him, confused. What do you mean? I mean, maybe you accept what they're offering, but on your terms. You don't have to take their money or whatever shady business they're pushing. Instead, you propose something that aligns with your values, something that they can't easily say no to, but something that keeps you in control. Derrick frowned, trying to follow Greg's line of thought. Like what? Like using their resources to help the community. You're always talking about how Maplewood needs more support, how the kids around here don't have enough opportunities. What if you told them you'd accept their reward, but only if they back a project that benefits the town, something they can't easily weasel out of, but something that doesn't tie you directly to them? Derrick sat back in his seat considering it. The idea was bold and it seemed risky, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The Hamiltons were clearly used to getting their way, but they were also a family that thrived on their image, an image of power, wealth, and influence. If Derrick proposed something that would make them look good, something they could spin as charitable and community-driven, they might be inclined to go along with it, especially if it didn't cost them much in the grand scheme of things. I don't know, Greg, Derrick said, hesitating. That sounds risky. If I get involved with them in any way, I'm still tied to them, even if it's for something good. Greg nodded. True, but think about it. You'd be the one in control. If they try to pull any shady moves, you can back out. And if it works, you'll have turned their influence into something positive for the town. You'd be helping people instead of letting them drag you down into whatever mess they're involved in. Derrick considered it for a long time, turning the idea over in his mind. It was dangerous, no doubt about that. But the alternative, continuing to refuse and risking further retaliation, was just as dangerous. This way, at least, he could dictate the terms. He wouldn't be selling out his values. He'd be using their resources to do what he'd always wanted to do, help others. After a long silence, Derrick looked at Greg and nodded slowly. You might be right. If I'm going to get through this, I need to take control. I need to make sure that whatever happens next, it's on my terms. Greg smiled slightly, a flicker of approval in his eyes. That's more like it. You've never been the kind of guy to let someone push you around. This way, you're standing your ground but not backing down. They'll respect that, or at least they'll play along because it serves them too. Derrick took a deep breath, feeling a sense of determination settle over him. This was risky, but it was the only option that made sense. Running wasn't an option, and neither was staying passive. If he was going to face this head-on, he needed to do it in a way that stayed true to who he was. The next day, Derrick didn't waste time. He knew that waiting too long would only increase the pressure from Bennett and the Hamiltons. He needed to act before they grew impatient. He sat down at his kitchen table, thinking carefully about how to frame his proposal. It had to be clear, direct, and beneficial to both sides. something that would make it difficult for them to refuse, but also something that would keep him out of their shadowy dealings. After hours of drafting and revising, Derrick had a plan. He would propose building a community center in Maplewood, a place that would serve the youth, provide educational programs, and offer resources for those in need. It would be funded by the Hamiltons but run independently, with oversight from the town and its leaders. It would be a project that aligned with Derrick's values, something that would genuinely help the people of Maplewood. And if the Hamiltons wanted to be involved, they'd have to play by his rules. That evening, he called Bennett. The conversation was brief, but the man seemed intrigued by Derrick's proposal. He didn't give anything away, but Derrick could sense that he hadn't expected this move. Bennett said he would relay the proposal to the family and get back to him. For the next few days, Derrick waited anxiously for a response. Every passing hour filled with uncertainty. He knew this could go either way. The Hamiltons could accept his terms, seeing the benefit of a positive public image, or they could reject it outright, seeing through his attempt to maintain control. But either way, Derrick was prepared. He had made his choice, and he wouldn't back down. Finally, the call came. Bennett's voice was smooth as always, but there was an edge of respect in his tone. "The Hamilton family has reviewed your proposal, Mr. Johnson. They find it interesting. They've agreed to your terms, with some conditions of their own, of course, but I believe we can make this work." Derrick felt a mixture of relief and caution wash over him. This was only the beginning, but for the first time in days he felt like he had a foothold, a way to navigate the treacherous waters he had been thrown into. He had set the terms, and now it was up to him to see it through. As Derrick hung up the phone, he looked out the window at the fading light of the day. The black SUV wasn't there anymore, but he knew the Hamiltons were still watching. They would always be watching. But now at least Derrick had a plan. He had chosen his path, and whatever came next, he would face it with his head held high. He had turned their offer into something that aligned with his values, something that would benefit his community. And in doing so, he had managed to stay true to himself, even in the face of overwhelming pressure. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the Hamiltons were far from harmless. But for the first time since this all began, Derrick felt like he had a fighting chance. With the Hamiltons agreeing to his proposal, Derrick felt a strange mixture of victory and apprehension. The relief of securing an outcome that aligned with his values was tempered by the knowledge that he was still dealing with a family that operated in shadows. Though he had managed to twist their offer into something positive, he knew this was far from over. The Hamiltons weren't the kind of people who gave without expecting something in return. The community center project was officially set in motion. Maplewood had never seen anything quite like it before. In the span of a few short weeks, the plans had moved from conceptual drawings to actual groundwork. The Hamilton family, true to their word, provided the funding without hesitation. The money flowed in effortlessly, too effortlessly, Derrick thought. And soon the quiet streets of Maplewood were bustling with construction crews, architects, and city planners. Derrick found himself at the heart of it all, overseeing every detail with a close eye. At first, the town was surprised by the sudden development, but once people realized Derrick was behind the project, any suspicion quickly faded. He had always been a trusted figure in the community, known for his integrity and genuine desire to help others. The news spread quickly, and soon people were stopping him on the streets, thanking him for his efforts, asking how they could get involved. Derrick's simple life had transformed overnight, but he made sure to stay grounded. He knew the Hamiltons' involvement cast a long shadow over the project, but for now he had control, and that was what mattered. The community center was more than just a building. It represented hope for Maplewood, a town that had struggled to provide its youth with opportunities. The new facility would include classrooms for after-school programs, a gymnasium, a library, and even a small auditorium for events. Derrick had insisted that the center also offer vocational training, knowing that not every kid in Maplewood had college in their future, but all of them deserved a chance to learn skills that would help them succeed. Derrick spent every waking moment overseeing the construction. He had little experience in large-scale projects, but he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. He was on site almost every day, consulting with engineers, talking to the workers, and ensuring that everything was being built to last. He had a vision for this center, and he wasn't going to let anything compromise it, not even the Hamiltons. Still, their presence loomed in the background. Derrick had expected them to be more involved, but so far they had kept their distance. Bennett occasionally called to check on progress or send a lawyer to review contracts, but there were no sudden visits, no attempts to take over the project. It was almost too easy. Derrick couldn't help but wonder when the other shoe would drop. Despite his wariness, the project moved forward smoothly. By the time the walls of the community center were going up, the people of Maplewood were buzzing with excitement. Kids rode by on their bikes, peering through the construction fences to catch a glimpse of the building that would soon be theirs. Parents talked about the possibilities, how their children would finally have a safe place to go after school, how the center would bring the town together in a way it hadn't been before. Derrick tried to let that excitement lift his spirits, but the weight of the Hamiltons' involvement still pressed on him. Every time he signed off on a delivery of materials or approved a new hire, he wondered if this was the moment they would reveal their true motives. He couldn't forget the warnings Lily had given him, the danger that lurked beneath the surface of her family's wealth and power. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a burnt orange, Derrick was the last person on the construction site. The workers had packed up for the day, and the machines sat silent, casting long shadows across the unfinished building. He stood in the middle of what would soon be the main hall, imagining the laughter of children, the sound of basketballs echoing in the gym, the hum of learning in the classrooms. But before he could get lost in that vision, he heard a noise, a soft crunch of gravel underfoot. Instinctively, Derrick turned, his heart skipping a beat. For a moment he saw nothing, just the empty site and the quiet town beyond. But then, stepping out from the shadow of a nearby stack of lumber, Bennett appeared. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Bennett's voice was smooth as ever, though there was something unsettling in the way he stood, his posture too relaxed for someone walking through a construction zone at dusk. Derrick's jaw tightened. He had been expecting this. "Yeah, it's coming along." Bennett strolled toward him, his polished shoes silent on the dusty ground. "You've done well, Derrick. The people of Maplewood should be grateful to you. This place will change lives." Derrick crossed his arms, watching Bennett carefully. "That's the idea." For a moment, Bennett just smiled, as if he could hear the unspoken tension in Derrick's voice. He walked slowly around the open space, taking in the structure with casual interest, though Derrick could tell there was nothing casual about it. Bennett wasn't here to admire the progress. He was here for something else. "You've handled this project impressively," Bennett said, his tone conversational but laced with something more. "The Hamilton family appreciates that. They've been watching closely, and I have to say, they're impressed with your ability to manage such an important undertaking." Derrick's muscles tensed. He had been waiting for this, the moment when the Hamiltons would reveal their real intentions. "It's a good project," Derrick said cautiously. "One the town needs." "Indeed," Bennett replied, nodding. "And it's a reflection of what can happen when people like us come together. The Hamiltons have always believed in giving back, in using their influence to make the world a better place. This center, it's just the beginning." Derrick felt the warning bells go off in his mind. "The beginning of what?" Bennett smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "Of a much larger initiative. You see, Mr. Johnson, the Hamiltons are interested in expanding this model, not just here in Maplewood, but in towns all over the state. You've shown us what's possible when resources are used correctly, and we believe there's potential for something far greater than just one community center." Derrick's heart sank. He had feared this from the start, that the Hamiltons would take what he had built and twist it into something that served their own interests. Expanding the project sounded good on the surface, but Derrick knew better. He could already see how it would go. More money, more influence, more strings attached. The community center would no longer be a symbol of hope. It would become a tool for the Hamiltons to tighten their grip on towns like Maplewood. "I didn't sign up for a statewide initiative," Derrick said, his voice firm. "This was about helping my town, not becoming part of something bigger." Bennett's expression didn't falter, but there was a sharpness in his eyes now. "I understand your hesitation, but think of the good you could do on a larger scale. You've already proven you can make a difference here. Why not bring that same vision to other towns? Imagine how many lives you could change. Derrick shook his head. That's not what this was about. I didn't get involved with the Hamiltons to spread their influence. This was about Maplewood, about giving this town something it needed. And you've succeeded, Bennett replied smoothly. But the Hamiltons see potential in you, Derrick. You could be more than just a local hero. You could be someone who shapes the future of entire communities. All we ask is that you consider the possibilities. Derrick could feel the pressure in Bennett's words, the thinly veiled push to get him to comply. This was the trap he had been trying to avoid. The Hamiltons had given him what he wanted: funding, resources, a community center. But now they wanted something in return. They wanted him to be their pawn, to expand their influence under the guise of charity. I appreciate the offer, Derrick said slowly, choosing his words carefully. But I'm not interested in turning this into something bigger. My focus is here, on Maplewood. That's where it will stay. Bennett's smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker of annoyance passing through his expression before he regained his composure. I understand your loyalty to this town, Derrick, but I think you'll find that opportunities like this don't come around often. The Hamiltons don't forget those who help them. They reward loyalty. Derrick's temper flared at the underlying threat in Bennett's words. This was exactly what he had feared, a veiled ultimatum wrapped in polite words. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. I don't need a reward, Bennett. I just want to finish this project the way I started it. For the first time, Bennett's smile disappeared completely. He straightened, his casual demeanor replaced by something colder, more businesslike. You've done well so far, Derrick, but don't forget who made this possible. The Hamiltons expect their partners to be cooperative. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken tension. Derrick knew he was walking a fine line, but he refused to be intimidated. He had come too far, fought too hard, to let the Hamiltons control him now. I'm grateful for the Hamiltons' support, Derrick said evenly, meeting Bennett's gaze, but I won't compromise my principles. If they want to be involved in this project, they'll have to respect that. Bennett's eyes narrowed, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them crackled with quiet hostility. Finally, Bennett gave a small nod, though the gesture was more of a warning than an agreement. Very well, Mr. Johnson. I'll relay your thoughts to the family, but I hope you understand the importance of maintaining a good relationship with them. They don't take kindly to refusals. With that, Bennett turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the construction site. Derrick stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the unfinished walls of the community center, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. He had made his stand, but he knew this wasn't the end. The Hamiltons wouldn't give up so easily. They had too much power, too much influence, and Derrick had just made himself a target by refusing to play their game. He had known from the beginning that dealing with them was dangerous, but now that danger was becoming all too real. As the days passed, the pressure only intensified. The Hamiltons' representatives continued to contact Derrick, subtly pushing him to reconsider their offer, reminding him of the potential rewards. But Derrick stood firm, determined to see the project through on his own terms. The community center neared completion, and despite the growing tension, Derrick couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in what he had accomplished. The building was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a symbol of hope for the people of Maplewood, a place where children could learn, grow, and dream of brighter futures. It was everything Derrick had wanted it to be. But as the grand opening of the center approached, Derrick couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The Hamiltons wouldn't let this go, not without a fight. He had made his choice, but the consequences of that choice were still unfolding. On the day of the opening, the entire town of Maplewood gathered to celebrate. The streets were filled with smiling faces, and the sound of laughter echoed through the air. The community center stood tall, a beacon of hope and progress, and Derrick found himself surrounded by friends and neighbors, all eager to thank him for his hard work. But even in the midst of the celebration, Derrick felt the shadow of the Hamiltons looming. He knew they were watching, waiting for their moment. And as the speeches began and the ribbon was cut, Derrick couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before the storm. The community center was open, The town was happy, and Derrick had achieved what he set out to do. But he also knew that the Hamiltons wouldn't forget his refusal. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The opening of the community center was a triumphant moment for Maplewood. The town gathered in droves, with kids running across the newly paved basketball courts, families strolling through the bright hallways, and the smell of barbecue filling the air from the food trucks parked outside. For the first time in months, Derrick felt a sense of genuine pride. He watched as children eagerly explored the facility, their eyes lighting up at the new computers in the library, the gymnasium, and the art rooms that would soon host after-school programs. The center represented everything Derrick had hoped for, a place where the next generation could thrive. Local officials gave speeches, praising Derrick for his vision and leadership. Parents shook his hand, thanking him for giving their kids a safe place to go after school. The mayor even hinted at naming the main hall after Derrick, a gesture that embarrassed him more than anything. He didn't care about recognition. This project had never been about him. It had been about the people of Maplewood, and seeing them embrace it filled Derrick with an undeniable sense of fulfillment. As the day wore on and the crowd began to thin, Derrick stood back and observed the scene from a distance. The sun was setting behind the community center, casting a warm orange glow over the town. It should have been a moment of pure satisfaction, the culmination of months of hard work, but something gnawed at the back of his mind. The Hamiltons' involvement hung over him like a dark cloud, even as the townspeople celebrated. He couldn't forget Bennett's cold warning: "The Hamiltons don't take kindly to refusals." Derrick knew that just because the center had been built didn't mean the Hamilton family was done with him. They had agreed to his terms for now, but there was no doubt in his mind that they would try to exert their influence again. This wasn't just about the center. It was about control. The Hamiltons had their fingers in everything they touched, and Derrick knew they wouldn't walk away without getting something in return. He could almost feel them lurking in the background, watching the event unfold, waiting for the right moment to assert their power. As night fell and the last of the families left, Derrick was approached by Maya, a young woman who had volunteered to help with the center's youth outreach programs. She had been one of the first to get involved when the project was announced, and her passion for the work was infectious. Maya was fresh out of college, full of energy and ideas for how to make the center a hub of activity for the town's kids. "This is incredible, Derrick," she said, smiling as she looked around the now quiet building. "You did it. You really did it." Derrick smiled, but it was a tired one. "It wasn't just me. A lot of people helped to make this happen." Maya nodded, her enthusiasm undimmed. "Sure, but it was your vision. You brought everyone together. The kids are going to love this place. You can already see it in their faces." He appreciated her words, but there was a weight on his chest that wouldn't lift. Maya had no idea about the compromises Derrick had made to get this far, or the danger that still loomed because of the Hamiltons. He didn't want to burden her with that knowledge. The community center was supposed to be a beacon of hope, not a reminder of the shadows that threatened it. "I'm glad they're excited," Derrick said, glancing at the empty gymnasium. "But this is just the beginning. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." Maya looked at him thoughtfully, sensing that something was on his mind. "Is everything all right? You don't seem like you're celebrating." Derrick paused for a moment, weighing how much to reveal. He didn't want to dampen her spirits, but he also couldn't ignore the storm that was brewing. "There's a lot more going on behind the scenes than people know," he said carefully. "I'm just trying to make sure this place stays focused on the community." Maya frowned. "What do you mean?" "The funding came from some powerful people," Derrick explained, his voice low. "People who might want to use the center for their own purposes. I'm doing my best to keep that from happening, but it's not going to be easy." Maya's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look scared. She looked determined. "Well, if there's anything I can do to help, you know I'm in. We can't let anyone take this place away from the community." Derrick nodded, feeling a small surge of hope. Maybe he wasn't completely alone in this. "Thanks, Maya. I appreciate that." After Maya left, Derrick locked up the center and walked back to his truck. The streets were quiet, and for the first time in weeks, there was no sign of the black SUV. It was a small comfort, but Derrick wasn't naive enough to think the Hamiltons had given up. They were patient, calculating, and they would wait until the right moment to make their next move. The following weeks were busy. The community center officially opened, and it quickly became a hub of activity. Kids filled the classrooms, participating in after-school tutoring and vocational programs. The gym was alive with the sound of basketball games and fitness classes. Parents volunteered their time, helping to keep the place running smoothly. Derrick spent nearly every day at the center, overseeing operations, solving problems, and making sure the Hamiltons' influence stayed out of the picture. But despite the success, there was an undercurrent of tension. The Hamiltons' presence loomed, even if it wasn't visible. Bennett hadn't contacted Derrick since the night of the opening, but Derrick knew it was only a matter of time before they resurfaced. And when they did, he had to be ready. One afternoon, about a month after the center's opening, Derrick received an unexpected visit. He was in his office at the back of the center, going over the monthly budget, when there was a knock at the door. He looked up, surprised. No one usually came by his office without notice. "Come in," he called. The door opened, and to Derrick's surprise, Lily Hamilton stepped inside. She looked different than the last time he had seen her, more composed but with an air of quiet tension that suggested she wasn't here for a social visit. "Lily," Derrick said, standing up, "I wasn't expecting to see you again." Lily offered a faint smile. "I didn't think I'd be back either. But we need to talk." Derrick gestured to the chair across from his desk, and Lily sat down. He could tell something was weighing on her, something serious. "What's going on?" Derrick asked, sitting back down. "Is it your family?" Lily nodded, her eyes dark. "Yes, they've been watching everything. The community center, the people involved. Shoo! And they're not happy. My father and Bennett, they don't like that you've kept them at arm's length." Derrick felt his stomach tighten. He had known this was coming, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. "What do they want?" "They want control," Lily said bluntly. "They want to use this place as a way to expand their influence, just like they always do. My father sees the community center as an opportunity to build connections, to make Maplewood part of a larger network of towns under Hamilton control. And Bennett, he's been pressuring my father to push you harder, to make you cooperate." Derrick leaned forward, his jaw tight. "I'm not going to let that happen." Lily sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I know, and that's why I'm here. Derrick, I don't think you realize how dangerous they can be. They won't stop until they get what they want. They'll start subtle, but if you keep resisting, they'll escalate. My father plays the long game, but Bennett, he's more direct. And if he feels like you're a threat, he won't hesitate to take action." Derrick's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "What kind of action?" Lily hesitated, her eyes darting to the door as if someone might be listening. "They've already started digging into your life. Bennett's been gathering information about you, your family, your past. He's looking for leverage, something he can use to force your hand." Derrick clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had suspected they would try something like this, but hearing it confirmed made his blood boil. "I don't have anything to hide." "That doesn't mean they won't fabricate something," Lily said quietly. "They've done it before. People who stand in their way, they find themselves dealing with scandals, legal trouble, or worse. And once they have something on you, they'll use it to manipulate you into doing what they want." Derrick leaned back in his chair, his mind buzzing with the implications. The Hamiltons were playing a dangerous game, and they weren't afraid to ruin lives to get what they wanted. But Derrick wasn't about to let them destroy everything he had built. "So what do I do?" he asked, his voice low. "How do I stop them?" Lily looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and regret. "I don't know if you can stop them, Derrick, but you can protect yourself. Don't give them any ammunition. Keep everything above board, and don't give them any reason to come after you. But you need to be careful. Bennett isn't patient. If he can't get to you through legal means, he'll find another way." Derrick took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of anger and fear swirling inside him. He had come too far to let the Hamiltons take over. The community center was for Maplewood, for the people who needed it most, not for a family looking to expand their power. "I'm not backing down," Derrick said firmly. "If they come after me, I'll deal with it. But I'm not going to let them take control of this place." Lily nodded, though her expression remained troubled. I was afraid you'd say that. There was a long silence between them, the weight of the conversation settling like a heavy fog. Derrick knew this wasn't over. The Hamiltons would come after him, one way or another. But he wasn't going to back down. He had made his choice, and he would fight to protect what he had built, no matter the cost. Lily stood up, her movements slow and hesitant. I'll keep an eye on things from my side, try to slow Bennett down. But you need to be prepared, Derrick. This isn't going to end easily. Derrick stood as well, his eyes meeting hers. Thank you, Lily. I appreciate the warning. She gave him a small, sad smile. I wish I could do more, but just be careful. With that, Lily left, her footsteps echoing through the quiet hallway as she disappeared out the door. Derrick stood alone in his office, the silence pressing down on him. He felt the weight of the Hamiltons' power, the knowledge that they were watching, waiting for their moment to strike. But Derrick was ready. He had come too far to let fear control him. The weeks that followed were tense. Derrick continued to run the community center, but there was a constant sense of being watched, of waiting for the next move. Bennett's presence lingered like a shadow, unseen but always felt. Derrick kept everything above board, knowing that any misstep could be used against him. He made sure the finances were transparent, that the staff was well-trained, and that the programs were running smoothly. But despite his best efforts, the sense of impending conflict never left. Then one evening, as Derrick was locking up the center after another long day, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from an unknown number. He frowned, pulling it out and opening the text. We need to talk. Tomorrow, 8 p.m., same diner, come alone. Derrick stared at the message, his pulse quickening. He knew what this meant. The Hamiltons were making their move.